They were born Patricia Ann and Nancy Ann Schmitz in 1934 and are the granddaughters of one of the most important figures in West Seattle's history. West Side Seattle had the opportunity to spend some time with these two remarkable women, whose memories of the days spent with Fafa and Mutter, Ferdinand and Emma Schmitz, still sparkle in their retelling. The Schmitz family, inspired by their patriarch Ferdinand, had a tradition of being civic-minded and caring about nature. After acquiring more than 120 acres of land in the Alki neighborhood in the early 1900s, they donated much of it to the city of Seattle, creating a nature preserve in Schmitz Park, whose land and plants have remained essentially as they have been for centuries. The 53-acre park is the largest stand of old-growth forest in the city, and huge trees and nurse logs dominate the landscape. A spring-fed creek runs through the park as well, and is the focus of an effort to daylight it, restore a historic salmon run, and highlight the park's history. The Schmitz twins spent many days at the family's home on Beach Drive called Sans Sushi. The 17-room German-style home was only one of 4 homes on Alki when it was built. Great to meet you. Can you tell me who you are and where you were born?
I'm Nancy Wilson, Nancy Ann Schmitz Wilson, and I was born in 1934 at Swedish Hospital on August 16th, 1934, and with my twin sister, we were to have been another boy. We enjoyed the incubators for 5.5 months.
Who was actually born first?
I was 7 minutes older than my sister Patricia, and I was Nancy Ann, and I also have the birth certificate as Nancy Duncan, so I have 2 birth certificates.
That makes you sort of rare.
Very rare. I would have to take both to Canada.
Is that right? Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Well, can you tell me about your most vivid memories of Sans Sushi and any early memories of West Seattle?
Oh, I love going to West Seattle. We usually generally went every weekend, mainly on a Sunday, I believe, to see Mutter and Fafa. I played with all my cousins that lived there, and it was wonderful. We would enjoy the beautiful garden and the beautiful kind of little pond with an island with a little bridge going across it. It was just a charming experience to have that German style of a home, very strange, with parlors, one for sewing and one for dancing, where you had to take your hand and wind up the Victrola by hand to have the music, and it just was a wonderful place for us to go on the weekends. And then eventually, when we were 21 or going on 22, my parents built a home on 55th and Genesee, and so we had a horrendous view, and all the relatives over the hill down on Beach Drive said it can't be done. Well, my dad was an engineer, and he just got a bulldozer and lowered the land, and the families across the street at 55th of Genesee absolutely could not believe the view they had. And so my dad promised them he would always maintain it, that they would have a view. And they were all so grateful because they had never seen the water, and they had everything open to them, Vashon Island, Southworth, and the ferries all going to Bainbridge, and it was fabulous.
Did you ever take the streetcar down the middle of West Seattle on California Avenue?
I believe I did, but my streetcar days were really from in the Mount Baker district, from the end of the line to the end of the line where Patsy and I, after going to John Muir Public School, we ended up at Forest Ridge Convent, a very lovely Roman Catholic cloistered school. We were Presbyterian girls, and the nuns were wonderful, and the school was wonderful. But we left because we wanted to not take certain courses that we would have to take at Forest Ridge. So we went to Helen Bush and graduated from Helen Bush School in 1956.
What did you study there at Helen Bush?
Well, Helen Bush just offered every common class. I mean, it was humanities, you know, English, history.
ICP was Introduction to Current Problems.
Yes, and
I wish they still had that class.
right,
Yeah.
we should have it, definitely.
Yeah.
That was a very important class.
That was led by the head, you know, Mrs. Livingood, who ran Helen Bush School.
What were your favorite things to do when you came to West
Oh,
Seattle?
well, we loved to play hide-no-seek. I'm Patsy. We loved to play hide-no-seek with our cousins because using the common driveway from down off of Beach Drive, came up the hillside, passing two homes, one Uncle Dietrich and Aunt Peggy, and our three cousins, Gloria, Alan, and Margaret Ann. And then on up the drive, the next house was our Uncle Harold and Aunt Emmy Hartman, Schmidt's daughter, and her three daughters. Emmy was the oldest, and she did get married to Chuck Padelford, who died very young. And she moved on to San Francisco, where she worked at the Hartman bookstore. So she wasn't around, you know, as much as the others. But then there was the younger sister, Carolyn, who, along with Margaret Ann, Alan, Gloria, Janet, us two, and I believe there were neighbors from next door, like where Gail's from, playing hide and seek. And I remember Gail. I mean, Gail's a lot younger than us, but I do remember at Mutter and Fafa's in the dining room, so huge oval table, and from one end of the house were leaded windows. To the far,
It was the width of the house.
the width of the house was a bench, and it, you know, had nice cushion seating on it. And outside that window was a beautiful pond where the water came down and there were fish. But back to the dining room, beyond that table was another table. So when we had these family dinners, I mean, for Nancy and me, we were not the older cousins in the family. However, there were a lot of younger ones, and there was little Jannie Huguenin, there was Susie Bowman, that's their married names now, and just a lot of children, and Gail and her brother, and her dad was always there, her mom, and Aunt Frankie.
Who were you closest
their
to?
grandmother.
Who in your family were you closest to?
In that family, who was I closest to as far as cousins?
Yes.
Believe it or not, it was Mary Elizabeth Schmitz Hoff. Her dad was at the University of Minnesota, and we loved Uncle Henry. He was a wonderful uncle, wonderful brother to my dad, and he had two children. Melba was his wife, Melba Nelson, and they had a son, Henry Nelson. Hank was shot down on February 21st, 1945, and never found in the Second World War. My nephew, Ferdinand IV, has his DNA on file to try to match if they ever find him. And then there was his sister, Mary Elizabeth. We called her Sis. And she was our closest cousin on that side of the family, other than Alan, who was Margaret Ann's twin brother. And we loved Alan, and we just had an awful lot of fun. But together, on a Sunday afternoon, at the top of this driveway was a big tree. And you had to maneuver your car off to this side to park it, or around over here to park it. A 3-car garage, A1 license, all these little numbers. I think it was just a 1 or an A at one point.
Uncle D
Uncle
was number
D.
1
And
citizen.
so those were open door garages. And Aunt Emmy's house, front door was right there. Then there was a drive down to Aunt Peggy and Uncle Deet's house, just a narrow drive. And a beautiful flowing little stream coming down into a pond as you drove past down this little drive. But Aunt Peggy always had to back her car out a long ways to go to the grocery store. So she eventually changed that for herself and put the driveway, isn't that right, on the other side of the house. But we had a lot of fun playing hide-and-go-seek. I mean, there were a bunch of us. And then in this beautiful house, which I call California lodge style. My husband better knows the names that would apply to it. But there was a marvelous pool room upstairs, and we just played pool, and then we played the Victrola, had to keep winding it.
And wind it up.
And it was just,
Another point, Patsy, was to go through that house, you had to pull strings
this way.
in order to turn on a light to get to where you were going. There were no light switches. The telephone was on the wall, and being little children, we were stacked up on many boxes to speak to a speaker. And we would call Germany during the Second World War, and I remember we were constantly saying, "Over," and it was quite a unique situation.
Yeah.
So it was like using a radio.
Yes,
Mm-hmm. Had a
very much so.
kind of a microphone type of thing. It was very unusual. But when you enter, first of all, I'll tell you, when you came up this drive back to that tree where we would play, put our heads against for hide and seek, and everybody had scattered. Well, you couldn't get out of your car there at that point. You couldn't drive much further than that. There was one little car garage, kind of a shed that Uncle Dietrich used off to the left-hand side of this walkway to Mutter and Fafa's house. There was a large walkway going down on the west side, but on the east side, we always went down this walkway, a bank filled with St. John wort, as was this big patch, all St. John wort. And then Mutter and Fafa's bedroom windows right there at the end of this walkway, and you turned, you went down this little narrow, very, very narrow walkway, and there was a metal railing, and you looked down into their basement, and it was very scary. It just seemed very scary. On this side, there was stacked up coal, wood, and paper in bins. And then there was a large bin for storing all kinds of things. On this side of this porch, as you entered, went up about 2 steps, there was a large workbench, and go out there and fill a pot of dirt, My grandmother just had plants everywhere. And you go to the back door, it's a glass door, and you turn the thing to ring the bell, or else you just walk in if it was, unlocked. And it was fantastic. You walk into this kitchen, there was a table that's about as large as this room with oilcloth. And all these many children, Gail's grandfather or great-grandfather being one of them that lived in that home, as my grandfather brought his brother's children, I believe. 6 of them from Germany to be raised in our country for a period of time, and some stayed. Henrietta died, and walk through that kitchen, you open this door, and here you've got this big dining room table, the long bench, the other table, and then you had what was really the front house door. And it was this little tiny door, but it had a little sun porch, about 5 feet deep or less, filled with plants, and that was the front door. And then this long porch that stretched the whole width of the house, and the wisteria just hung beautifully, and then these big bells that they rang to bring all the children to dinner.
What was dinner like in those days?
Pardon me?
What was dinner like in those days?
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Fabulous roast beef.
Roast beef and sauerkraut. And
wonderful.
Zeppelin beans that my grandmother, when she arrived the day after the Seattle fire, had in her pockets of her big dress, was carrying filled with Zeppelin beans. We have some of those seeds somewhere in this house. My dad continued growing those seeds until he could no longer garden out in West Seattle. And they were the most wonderful beans you could ever eat in your life. They had no strings. They were very, very long. And just interesting things took place in that house. It was just a fabulous house. Mother was known for her honey sugar cookies. I mean, they were kind of a honey cake cookie with a white frosting.
Difficult to chew.
Difficult, very, very chewy, crunchy, a combination of different texture. But we loved them. But she had these massive cookie cans. She put them up on the highest shelf
To keep the granddaughters.
to keep the granddaughters and the grandchildren, because there was boys. Alan was, and my brother. My brother would bike over on the weekend to see his grandparents when he was really young.
That was from the Mount
And
Baker.
from Mount Baker Park, where we were raised. And one thing about that cookie, we always wanted them. And Mother says, no, not today, not today. Well, you left her kitchen, which was this very old-fashioned stove, turned the corner, and the phone on the wall, and you pulled a chain, and there was a high counter, and then the glass doors with all the Butler Hotel china in this. But up on this very top shelf were the cookies. So once in a while, Nancy and I we maneuvered, and you know, we got our share of cookies. And what was really fabulous about Mother and Fafa's house is that it was so old-fashioned. I mean, everything was reaching for a string. And our grandparents that lived in Mount Baker over here was quite a different type of a residence. And so we'd go there at least 3 to 4 days of the week during the week to see those grandparents. And we were very family. And we had the Duncan family, Dr. William Duncan and Dr. John Duncan in Mount Baker, along with my grandparents, the Duncans. And so we're just totally oriented towards family. And by contrast of going to Mount Baker residence and to West Seattle was just a delightful experience. And one I'm so grateful I had, that I wish a lot of people had in their life, because I think it's very telling that you don't need a lot to be happy, because my grandmother was, although stern, she was a happy person. She loved her garden, and the garden was magnificent. And Gail can certainly attest to that, because she visited that. Isn't that right?
Can you tell me anything about your grandfather, Ferdinand?
I remember him as just being an ever so sweet man,
Sweetheart,
just
a
a
sweetheart.
loving man. He had been injured. He sat in a Morris chair. of which I think Vicky has now, I'm not sure. But he sat in this Morris chair, and he would just reach out to hug the two of us together. And he smoked cigars, and we, we didn't.
Well, I was very impressed. They had a piano, and it impressed me that they had a small vase up on the top of the piano of cotton, and they grew that cotton. In their garden, they had every imaginable vegetable that you could think of growing that you wouldn't think would grow in the Northwest. They had chickens. It was just beyond measure. They had a different world.
Like, you come down the hillside from their home, down into the garden, and row after row of berries. Now, Gail and Nancy and I loved picking those berries. We generally had Alan with us to pick berries. And there were loganberries, raspberries, and then there were the peas. Now, we were to pick peas, but we ate more than we picked. And Aunt Emmy got extremely upset about that. But off to the side from where the berry patches were, then there was a stretch of green grass with beautiful flowering cherry trees. But over back against the hillside, there was a small sand. These garden beds were all in
sand,
all in rectangular or square shapes. And there were, over here, 2 patches of lily of the valley. Across from them would be a patch going this way of artichoke plants. And leaving the lily of the valley patches and walking to the west, to the water, were 2 holly, beautiful stylized holly things. It was like it was a place for a bride to walk under. And when you went through that, then you got out to the area where you could get over to where the pond was. But the pond, and there's a beautiful pond. And we do have a photo we can share of that pond. But Alan and Nancy and I loved picking out the pollywogs. Right.
And so, I mean, the whole life of West Seattle was entirely different than our life on Cascadia Avenue. And we were really closer to my mother's parents because Fafa died when we were about 9 years old, I believe.
Going on 10.
Yes, and Mamie and Bobby lived much longer and lived just up about 5 blocks from our home. And so we loved either riding our bicycles or walking up Cascadia Avenue to 2601 Cascadia.
Did you ever go down to the beach in West Seattle?
Oh,
yes,
absolutely.
and
High boulders.
Our cousin, Hank, and was it Hank and Chuck Padelford?
Mm-hmm. They would piggyback.
They would piggyback ride us. Unfortunately, Chuck Padelford, he was married to Emmy. They were married very young, and he died on a sailboat race out on the Sound, on Puget Sound, of diabetes. And he was a very dear person, and one of each, and then Hank died in the English Channel, they kind of think. But those 2 cousins were fabulous young boys.
They were wonderful to us,
And they would take us along Beach Drive and help us down over all the rockery to the water where the jellyfish would scare us to death. And we just had wonderful experiences with our cousins over there in West Seattle, and it's just wonderful memories to have. I do wish that my dad's father had lived a bit longer, but he did have a good life and he worked hard. He had the Butler Hotel, and he put beautiful bathrooms down under the pergola. There's 2 of them, one for men and one for women. but I believe it was during the Second World War. They were getting used abusively, so they had to lock them up. And they're all beautiful white marble and
Yeah, we used them, and they were
Beautiful.
truly gorgeous.
That's under the pergola in Pioneer Square, downtown Seattle.
Yes, well, Fafa was on the city council and the park board, and he had taken our dad, who was the youngest of all the children by many years. I think my dad was about 3 or 4 years old, and it was a Saturday, and he needed the men's room, and he had to take him into a saloon. So when he went to the to the council meeting, he said, it's not going to work out. We got to have a lavatory. And they said, what are you talking about? He said, well, I'm never taking my son into a saloon again to use the men's room or the gentleman's room. And, well, what do you want to do about it? He says, well, we need property. We need to build a bathroom. I'll build it myself. I said, well, that's great. You can have the property at the foot of the hill. And so under that pergola is where the bathroom went.
What year was that?
I think they put in that, my dad was born in 1905, and I think that went in about 1910 or 11. 1904. I think the bathroom went up about 1910, possibly. And
it was gorgeous.
A beautiful Alaska marble brass fittings. I remember all the row of all the sinks.
My grandfather paid for this. However, the city paid him back several years later and gave him more than he had paid for putting it in, because
They
it
were
was
grateful.
so highly respected that he had done that for the city. Fafa was very civic minded. He is the one that had them put the Duwamish River Bridge over the Spokane Street Bridge over the Duwamish River, and he just would tell the city council and the park board and whatever he was on, you do this for West Seattle or else. So that's the way it went.
Wow. Did you understood at that time, was that clear to you that he was such a powerful man?
Oh, I never thought of him as being powerful.
Very quiet.
He's a quiet,
very quiet
gentle
soul.
man.
And
I mean, we got his picture there. You can see he just
So he was more dignified than
very
blustery?
He's a very dignified man.
very dignified.
Yeah.
As was our other grandfather. They both were.
Did you ever visit the land that's now called the Schmitz Park Reserve?
Yes.
Yes, we did.
Mhm.
I went there, well, with a date of mine. We drove down when you could drive down, and it was, to me, as I recall, it was a big circle for a parking area, and just soaring green trees. It was just absolutely gorgeous. But I said to David, I just don't feel too comfortable being so isolated. So, we drove back out. And then many years later, my dad was not in a position that he could leave the house. And the park board someone called and asked if he could come to a meeting down at the park, and he couldn't do that. So they asked us to come. And we went. Well, it was after that terrible storm, I believe, 68, maybe? I
Well,
can't
a
remember.
100-mile wind.
1962.
62. It's just the trees. I mean, it was, scary.
Up on 55th in Genesee, my parents' home had a lovely glass top table, wrought iron table, and my mother and I were in their living room, and by golly, this glass came up, went right across, boom. And I could not believe that we could have such wind. It was beyond all measure. And that evening, I went to a gentleman's home where he and his wife were smashing
Oh, we went there the night of the storm.
the
That's
night
right.
of the storm, and the trees of Schmitz Park were just howling.
Oh, just
And we were stamping our feet on grapes
and our car.
in their garage.
Our car was a Chevrolet Impala that we bought. We put $25 down and then made monthly payments and got ourselves this car. It was lifting up off the street. We don't want to lose our car.
That
You know,
100-mile
it was
wind
just,
was just something else.
Unbelievable experience. But other than that, no, I've not been back to Schmitz Park, but I've read all that is trying to be accomplished there, and I think it's just phenomenal that such an undertaking would be pursued, and I think in every way it should be accomplished.
So you're happy about the effort to restore the creek and
Oh,
bring
I'm
salmon
Very,
back?
very much
Thrilled,
so.
absolutely thrilled. Just couldn't be a finer ending at 90 years old. Well,
Does
I
it feel like they're honoring your family's legacy?
Well, I'm not really doing anything but telling the story. I just want people to enjoy what's out there that God gave the world to enjoy.
So you went back to the park, but you haven't been back to the park?
I went to the park. I think when I went, it was more still open pathways. There were some trees knocked down and you had to climb over the logs to get over the hump. But I think I did see it. I had a date with me and we didn't go up all to the whole top of it, but we did enjoy seeing the park. I mean, it was unique because there's very few places. If you're on the ferry, you could look over and see this very huge patch of evergreens, and I was always very proud to think that Fafa and Mutter thought enough about Seattleites that they would give land to the city and for that. And
Well, it's so beautiful to have a little forest within a city is a mighty gift. I mean, I don't think you could go to San Francisco or Los Angeles or New York and find a park as beautiful right in the city the size of Seattle, West Seattle.
When you came to West Seattle as girls, did you ever visit any of the businesses there? Did you ever go to Husky Deli or anything
Oh, we
like
sure
that?
did.
I went to the Husky Deli and I went to the cute shops on California Avenue. I spent
Charming
a lot of my earnings.
on
Which was-
California Avenue.
Well, I worked down on Harbor Island also for my dad at Burger Engineering or Burger Industries. And I was very married to West Seattle. I mean, I even put flower boxes on the windows of Burger because I wanted the people on the buses to see what Harbor Island could look like across the street from Fisher Flowering Mill with the railroad cars in between us. And I put in beautiful flower boxes on ladders, of course, and I planted red, white, and blue flowers, and it was very patriotic to look down on.
It was really colorful,
Burger.
you know. I'd look down from the bus coming home from work. I worked in downtown Seattle.
So tell me about your lives after you left West Seattle and you got married, and tell me about that part of your life.
Well, I got married in 1966, June 25th, and I lived at, my husband and I, Douglas Lyle Wilson was his full name. We lived at Edgewater Apartments, it's a newly married and nearly buried apartment complex, but we lived there. And then Doug had purchased this land that I'm on now, and it had cost him, the total price of the land was $13,000, and so he had paid on it. He had a gentleman move in and live with him in this little cottage house that was quite unique, and the gentleman was an engineer and a real craftsman, and he really fixed it up very nicely, except for the bathroom, which was you had to really angle your body to get into this tiny bathroom. But my dad fixed that along with my husband's uncle, and this house stood in this home that we're in now. It was approximately at the top step here to the atrium door. That was the size of the house going north and south, and east and west was even smaller. And
It was
we
cute.
we worked at paying off that loan. It was $13,000, I believe, Patsy, wasn't
I
it?
think that's what you told me.
For the whole thing. And we had beautiful holly trees. We had wonderful vegetables and fruits that were the neighbors. I think we gave more prunes, Italian prunes, to the food bank, to Seattle, than anyone could ever come up with in buying in a grocery store.
Yeah.
Because we had friends that would fill their trunks with our Italian prunes. They were so fabulous. And then we had plum trees, we had apple trees, and we had 2 fabulous holly trees that anybody around here, this was unknown to us, zone for farming, and the neighbors loved the holly. However, the architects designed a home here that's quite different than what I expected, because I wanted a Cape Cod colonial.
This is not
And
it.
I was told not to drive by for a while, and I couldn't figure that one out, but by golly, I couldn't quite figure out. When I did come one day with my Doug, I said, Doug, this looks very strange for Cape Cod, and what's that stick doing out on the tree? And my dad was over here, and he said to Dieter Mathis, the builder, Dieter, what is that stick for? Oh, Furry, that's my level. That's where I level the house. And my dad said, no, Dieter, you don't use a stick on a tree. You use a leveler. And so I have to admit, there are areas in this lovely unknown style of a home that are not exactly, you go a little bit uphill and downhill when you go from one room to the other, and it's very intriguing. And anyway, we enjoyed it. However, we thought it was going to be colonial, and I don't know what you call this style, but in about 1970, when it was finished being built, it was the home of the year, the architect home of the year. And so the 2 architects said that in the newspaper, that the explanation of this was a whole full page of the Seattle Sunday Times, and it explained how Nancy contributed the idea of filling a little space in their kitchen with a bookshelf for cookbooks. So I do have my shelf around the corner here that has my cookbooks. And these 2 men were quite unique. They didn't get along, and the best of the 2 died unexpectedly up at Mount Rainier with his little grandchildren, and he was taking them to see the wildflowers. It was a very sad situation. But this is my home, and Doug and I were just shocked that 1,000 people came through it to see it when we hadn't even put down a piece of carpet. You know, it was, I think it was
open to the public.
It was open to the public. I do think I had my dining room table from Hong Kong
I think so.
in there, in the dining room, and that was it. And
Not the current table there, but
right.
Patsy, tell me your story.
my story? Well, we're twins, and Nancy got married, so I had we were both at this point single, and on Wednesdays I would go to communion at Trinity Episcopal Church, which was our church, and we were extremely involved in that church in downtown Seattle. So it was Holy Week, and it was 1963, I believe, and I went to do the communion preparation for the clergy, and then it was always held in the little chapel during the middle of the week, and I went and did my duty. And Nancy and I, back in those days in the Episcopal Church, you had to wear little hats, and that was a bother, but we had little tams, so we had lookalikes. Well, at the altar was this young clergyman, and I was so moved by what he said that I still can remember the words. And so afterwards I had to remove the things and take them into the sacristy, which I did, and then put them properly away. And he was removing his vestments, and I said to Nancy, ask him, is he new here? She said, no, you.
Patsy was good at using me.
And
7 minutes older,
And so I said, well, okay. Well, I said, are you new here? And he said, no, I'm visiting. And I said, oh, that's nice. Who are you visiting? He said, well, I'm visiting Paul and Don and some other friends. I said, oh, well, where are you from? He said, well, I'm from Holy Cross Monastery. And I said, oh, that's nice. That's nice. I said, well, I guess, Nancy, we better be on our way. So we left. Well, he went home to the rectory where he was there as a guest. And he'd come up from California, from Santa Barbara, from the monastery. And he asked the rector, Paul, there's some twins. He said, oh yeah, they're older than you think, and one's engaged and I don't know which one. Well, he did know.
However, I was not engaged.
No, but he knew. So that was the end of that story. I was never going to see that young man again. And then I was at my parents' home, and they took the Episcopal newsletter. Well, they did not really go to the Episcopal church, but I was putting these newspapers away, and I picked up this Diocese of Olympia, and I saw this picture of this young man. It was George. And that man that I had seen, there in the sacristy. And so I thought, oh, that's interesting. He's still around town. He's going up to Snohomish and Monroe. Isn't that interesting, I tell myself. Well, so I just tucked the paper away, and a couple weeks later, it was probably, I think, Advent Sunday or something, we were to go to a house blessing in the University Village. Or, not University Village, but Laurelhurst. Political science professor, I believe. They were having this house blessing. So I made a little bowl of marinated mushrooms, and I thought, well, I could take a record called Advent Sunday they could play the music. And so, and I made a little dress, and we were at my parents', they were in Europe, and I had every dish dirty.
There couldn't have been a dish left that hadn't been used by the two of us.
It was in my clothes.
Incredible.
So Nancy and I head off to Laurelhurst, and walking up the walkway, I said, I don't know what we're coming to. Why are we doing this? So they opened up the front door. Well, here stood this George. I thought, that's interesting. He's here. So I, went in and I said hello to all the friends from Trinity Church, and I put my mushrooms over on the dining room table, and so I was then deciding I'd pass these mushrooms around, which I did, and they had this large bowl of grape punch. Everything goes into it. It's wonderful. So we were all drinking punch. I got over to George and he said, I'd like to talk to you. And I said, oh, well, I've got these mushrooms. He said, well, you can put them back on the table. So we started chit-chatting, and he said, why don't we go sit down on the sofa? So I said, well, let's get a little more punch. And so we got our punch and sat on the sofa. And he turned to me and said, you know, I've thought about you a lot. I said, oh, you have? That's interesting. And as the evening went on, we decided it was time to tidy up because the evening should end. He insisted to Nancy that he drive me home. And Nancy said, oh, no, my fiance or no, that won't work out. Well, the house was just a mess. We couldn't have anybody come. And it was a stormy November night.
Oh, terrible.
Well,
Rain
by golly,
like I've never
my dear twin, we don't get along all the time, but she went home and she cleaned that house spotless.
I laid a fire,
And
I opened up the bar doors and turned on the dim light of the bar.
the beautiful soft music. Okay, so George drives me home.
Oh, but let me share with them.
Yeah.
I had done all this work, cleaning up all the sewing fabrics, doing all the dishes and or hiding them in cupboards or whatever I could do. And then I get everything so beautifully done, and I sit in my dad's nice, comfortable chair, and I'm sitting there, and I hear noises, and I turn around, and here are three, what are those animals?
Raccoons.
3 raccoons at the sliding glass doors onto the patio. I looked at these 3 raccoons and said, what are you doing here? We've had a deer, and now we have you, but I'm not going to open the door. And it was quite an event. And so then, after I'd done all this hard work very quickly with a very bad headache, I went upstairs to my parents' room and went to bed. And it got later and later, and Patsy came upstairs around 2 o'clock and says, Nancy, I've met the man I'm going to marry.
Wow.
And that
Just
was
like
just,
that.
that was it.
So George, he said, as he was at the front door, well, when can I see you again? And I said, well, I don't know when you're available. And he said, well, I have Mondays off. And I said, well, tomorrow's Monday, and I work for the administrator at Maynard Hospital, so I'm right inside the lobby door, at the administrator's door, and if you want to come by, you know, you're welcome to come by. And he said, oh, let's plan on that, maybe around 3 o'clock. Well, that was going to be a challenge for me and for him because, you know, my gosh, I was just being blown away. I just knew I love this man. And
That
so,
fast? You fell in love that fast?
yeah, I did. It was. I fell in love with him in that chapel that day. And the thing is, it was just magical. It was absolutely magical. And so,
I dated my husband 7 years.
yes, so this was quite a contrast. And so Monday came, I went to work, I told my boss, Mr. Hanson, the administrator, I said, well, I'm going to introduce you to somebody today that, you know, you're going to probably like him and you're probably going to be upset that I like him. He said, what are you talking about, Patsy? I said, well, look, you're a married man with 5 children. So he said, well, I don't like the sound of this. I said, well, don't worry about it. So George showed up. But prior to his coming, about 10 minutes of 3, I got really nervous. I got so nervous that I was shaking. And I don't normally do that. So I went through Mr. Hanson's office, right out the door, right to the pharmacist. I said, I'm shaking. I have this friend coming.
That was Mel.
Mel Harrylock.
Mm-hmm.
I said, Mel, I need something to calm down. He says, oh, Patsy, we can take care of that. And he turned around and he says, well, let me see. We have Librum 5, 10, 25 milligram. I said, what in the world's that? He says, well, I'm just going to give you one of these. So he takes down this little box, takes out a bottle, takes out a little pill, pours me a little glass of water, gives me this pill. And I go back to my desk. Golly, 5 minutes later, George walks right through those glass doors across the lobby. This is where Gail was born, by the way, this hospital. So I stand up, we shake hands like we've just become introduced. And I introduce him to my boss. And I said, well, Mr. Hanson, we're going to go downstairs and have coffee. And of course, it was 3 o'clock. It was the time all the nurses in their starched white uniforms and their starched white caps were all down having coffee. And we went down the elevator, walked into the cafeteria, big round table. He sat here, I sat here. And I was just as calm as a cucumber. And he was just shaking. And he brought out a cigarette. And I could see, just shaking, poor man, you know. So all these nurses were just, oh my gosh, you know. He had his collar on. I mean, that attracts attention, I guess. So we had a wonderful visit, and he said, well, you know, I'd like to call you. I said, yeah, that'd be great. You know, I gave him my number. And he said, well, you'll hear from me by the end of the week, which I did. And I think in the time that George and I had that time together, we had probably a total of 4 dates, one being my engagement. And then we were married the following April. We dated a year. I was engaged on February 21st when I met him, and then we got married April 20th of 1967. Isn't that right? You were 66.
Mm-hmm.
So my parents had to put on 2 weddings in basically a calendar. I mean, you know, short period of time, and I had a very formal wedding with the Episcopal Bishop, Ivel Curtis over here, who baptized our daughter. Beautiful wedding at Trinity Church.
Gorgeous.
And a reception at the Seattle Women's Sunset Club. And it was just beautiful.
I had a family wedding with a sit-down dinner in West Seattle.
But I might add, my grandparents were a part of that wedding because on the altar at Trinity Church were boughs of their beautiful dogwood, Aunt Peggy's dogwood and Mother and Father's dogwood. And we had dogwood, and we had white tulips and daffodils and narcissus. It's beautiful.
What has it meant to you to be a Schmitz? What is that, the name it meant to you to be part of that family?
I was very proud to be a part of it because they were every one of the 4 boys and the ones that we didn't know very well from Germany were just wonderful Seattle citizens. They cared about people, and they all worked. Like my dad, Ferdinand, was on the board of Handcrest, which was a blind organization that made ties. And my dad says, you know, because Handcrest donated to United Way. And he said,
I sold the Handcrest. I worked at Frederick and Nelson's, and I sold those ties to people, the Handcrest ties. So they were.
My dad was there at Handcrest, and he got a friend, and he said, you know, I think we should do something about the Lighthouse for the Blind because they take from United Way instead of give. And by golly, my dad hired a school teacher to be in charge, and together those men, along with a couple other men, got the Lighthouse for the Blind absolutely #1 blind place that you could ever go to in your life, and they ended up giving to United Way instead of taking from United Way. And my dad was just a homebody, gardener and lover of nature, and he loved to duck hunt and fish
and play golf.
And when he had Burger, and he owned it, I mean, he didn't own the building, but he owned the business. But he said to me when I worked for him, he says, "Now Nancy, if anyone asks where I am, I don't like to lie. But remember, I'm out at the Seattle Golf Club with Everett Nordstrom. And just let them think I have a dentist appointment." And so faithfully, almost every Thursday, Daddy had something going on that was
away from the office.
But he felt, even as the head of this company, that he shouldn't leave even to take a break to play a game of golf out at the Seattle Golf Club. And then his friend, I believe, Everett died. They called him Whitey. I believe he ended up dying on the golf course.
Everett Nordstrom was also one of my dad's Sunday morning golf. They played golf every morning, Sunday morning.
Bruce Nordstrom was his son, I believe.
Right,
and
died this past year. Just died recently. In fact, our caregiver was with him when he died. Our dad played with, his foursome was Chuck Franklin with the bank. What was it? Pacific National Bank. And the head of Safeco. Not then John Soderberg. It was, I can't remember his name. And Everett Nordstrom himself. So I can't remember the man that was running Safeco.
No, I can't either, honey.
But he loved golf. I mean, he just had a world of friends. Everybody loved my dad. I sure did.
He was a big German, 100% German, good looking.
And our mom was a homemaker. She made all her clothes. She wove the fabric for our coats to go to school. She made everything we ever wore that I can think of. If we needed shoes, we'd go to Nordstrom. And the three men, the Nordstrom men, Lloyd and Elmer and Everett, would be standing at the door, and sometimes young Bruce. And they'd say, "Well, Margaret, we'll send to our Portland store for the other pair," because they only took one pair of our size. And that went on for years and years.
Yes, unreal.
And I mean, Seattle
was small
was
and
a
intimate.
family. Seattle was a family.
I feel tragedy for what people see now.
It's just tragic.
It's tragic because you could walk down any street in Seattle and you would know
somebody.
You would never go without seeing somebody. And you knew the clerks of different stores. You just knew everybody. It was intimate. Just a very loving, a loving
being
situation.
90, it doesn't seem like, I mean, I think when Frederick and Nelson's changed, and the Bon Marché, I think we lost so much.
Definitely.
I mean, they were kind of, the doorman at Frederick and Nelson's had been at my mother's wedding, and I don't think I had that same doorman. I had a doorman from Frederick and Nelson's, but I don't think it was the same one.
Oh, I must tell the story. Speaking of the doorman at Frederick's, I had been there with Patsy, and when you went in the main door, which was more or less the one that was more towards the water, towards the sound, the west, and but the doorman happened to be at the other door. And I had been in the store with Patsy, and at the end of a counter that was, quite long, was black velvet with a string of pearls. And I thought, oh, those are such beautiful pearls. I want those pearls. And so I was disappointed. I knew I couldn't get them. And I went home and I thought, I want those pearls, but I don't even have a charge account. I don't have any way of getting them. So I called the jewelry, that department, and asked for Mr. North. And I said, Mr. North, this is Nancy Schmitz, and I just love those pearls that you have on the black velvet, and I can't buy them, but could I charge them to my twin sister's charge account? He said, well, certainly, I will be glad to do that. So this was ironic. I'm working for my brother in Bellevue, and I need a raise. I was only making $345 a month, and I wanted a raise, and he wouldn't give me a raise. And I'm there getting these pearls, which I have on. They were $500, which was a lot of money. And so I drive up the next day to that doorman, which was at the east door, and by golly, my brother pulls up right behind me. The doorman comes out, and I said, oh, I'm here to get my little package that you have for Nancy Schmitz. Oh yes, I have that. I'll get that for you. He accidentally gave it to my brother, who I was trying to get a raise from. I said, oh no, if he comes to me.
Both reached out.
And so
Bruno's here.
I get my little box of pearls, and Ferdy gets whatever he was picking up. And so the next day, Ferdy says, what were you getting there at Frederick and Nelson's? I said, oh, Ferdy was nothing. I mean, it was just something that I saw that I wanted to pick up, and I was quite shocked to see that you were right behind me. And anyway, I got an item, and it was nothing that would interest you, so I never told them that it was these pearls.
Can I ask you this question? Why do you think it matters for people like the members of your family to be responsive to and care about the community and care about the people in the community? Why does that matter?
Well, because if you don't have people that care about others, you don't have a society.
Can I
that's
share with
livable.
you? This, I told you, was this was zone unknown to the two architects for farming. I'm expecting a Cape Cod colonial, like my parents in West Seattle. And they build this house. They're doing the garage, and by golly, the city, someone in Clyde Hill drives by. What's going on here? This garage is too deep. This is zoned for farming. You can't have a garage. You have to change the zoning to city. We're a town. You've got to cut off part of that garage.
That's Bellevue.
So consequently, our garage is quite squished, and it was very difficult to store much we could get one car in it, and then we had little narrow shelves, and that was about it for space in a nice, what we were going to have a roomy garage. But I mean, the architects didn't even look into the fact that this was zoned for farming. They were two very unknown,
Quantities.
unliking each other men, right?
Right. Yeah. Amazing it ever got done, but as far as contributing to any cause, you know, some people have a lot of energy and they give a lot of time. I never had much energy, but my total devotion really was to Trinity Church, and Nancy and I, you know, attended every function. They had a vestry meeting and a parish council gathering, and they needed money, and I was working, and so we gave them each $25 to start a parking lot, which was now where Skyline exists now. They still had to give it up to Skyline, but we started that parking lot that was formerly there, and you know, just little things. It was out of our paycheck, you know, and you just do what you can for other people in life. And some people have a lot of energy and can do a lot.
We would call for the blood bank,
And
we were
with the Junior League, and we worked mighty hard. We went to the blood bank for many, many years for the Boeing people to come in after 5 o'clock and give blood. And that was really a vital need, and it still is. And in fact, for that matter, I'll tell you something. I was just stunned, just absolutely stunned, that Nancy and I, after all those years of volunteering at the blood bank, it was generally, I think, on a Friday evening, these people came in and freely donated, gave something of themselves, and we had to record it all. And then when we got Mary in our lives, I realized that I couldn't be doing this. I couldn't be going to the blood bank. I couldn't be doing all the different things I did for the Junior League. So we called for open heart surgery on the weekend with reams of sheets for people to, you know, sign up for open heart surgery. But back to the blood bank. My daughter had very serious non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, twice, stage 4. And she's had breast cancer prior to that. And my son-in-law wanted to give back to the blood bank for what was done for Mary, because she's lucky we have her. We're just lucky to have her. And there's another thing. I mean, I love that church. George served in that church after George was in the full-time priesthood. He built a church in Northern California. He was prior to that in seminary. George had the most posh church in San Francisco, St. Mary the Virgin, and had the largest youth group in San Francisco. And because of that, you know, the bishop just hurried him on and sent him up to Northern California to live in a farmhouse where all the young ladies from Redding decided they wanted to go down the road to that little farmhouse. And the place grew and grew until they had property on the corner, and he oversaw, the bishop said, we've got Thomas White Associates to come in to raise money, and that would be fine. Well, that didn't work out. George had to raise the money, and he did, and they built this little church down there, St. Michael's. I think it's called St. Michael's and All Angels. I'm not sure. St. Michael's, just below Redding. I can't remember the town now, but sweet church. These candle holders are from the altar of that church. There were 6 of them, and after 30 years, they were going to modernize things and gave them back to George. But he came up here, and they needed him very badly up at Snohomish because Father Price had a heart attack. So he stayed, and he went on to Snohomish. So that's really why I didn't get to see him very much. There was no freeway on this side between us and Snohomish.
Definitely not.
It was just a narrow road, a scary road.
Could I interject here?
Yeah, well, after I got married.
My husband would go off to he worked mainly in real estate, and he'd go off to work around 9 o'clock, and around 9:20 I would leave, and I'd get in my little car, and I would go up the highway, and I would turn off for Snohomish, and I'd go to Snohomish, and I'd stay there until about 4 o'clock, and then come home. And then Doug didn't know I'd been up there, and he'd say, Nan, why don't we go up and see George and Patsy in Snohomish? Baggy, that would be wonderful. Let's do that. So I'd get in the car. I wouldn't tell him I had been there already that day. And so we would go up and stay and have a nice dinner. And we contributed a lot to that too. And we just had our little tricks of the trade. And it was just all very interesting.
Now, as far as my coming to Bellevue, that was another thing, because once I married George, and I'm now at Snohomish, his time off was midnight Sunday night until midnight Monday night. Well, you know, I had to do laundry. So I'd come down here and we'd stay in the little old house here if we ever came down here. However, we could really not spend the night. It was during the time that we spent the night and lived in the little old house here on this property was when George told the bishop that he wanted to put down roots and establish a family, start a family. And he was getting all these invites, you know, California, the desert, back east. He's getting, and I think he just wanted to be in one place. And he said to me, would it upset you that I'll never leave the priesthood, but I'm going to give up full-time ministry in the parish church? And I said, well, George, you know, I married you, and what you choose to do, that's up to you. And he said, well, I've got to call and ask your dad and your mom if it agrees with them. And my dad, he called my dad. My mom answered the phone, and she said, oh, George, it sounds like you have a good idea going. You talk to Ferdy. And so my dad got on the phone and said, well, George, you know, you're a smart young man, and I know you can get out there and find yourself a job. And I don't have too many contacts anymore. I've sort of been in the lumber business and hardware business and, you know, all the different things that he did. He said, but I'll do everything I can to help you. And what I'll do is for 3 months, I'll give you and Patsy $400 a month to live. Well, we were making $350. So, and out of that we tithed. And out of that we had the phone bill. And that was long distance in Snohomish. And there were good reasons to have to call the diocesan house. And so it just happened that George got really brave and wrote this letter to the bishop, and he wrote back and pleaded with him not to leave, but he would always respect him. And George just wrote back and said, I cannot change my mind on this matter. And so we came down here and we lived in that little house upstairs.
And the stairway was one of these.
It had to
it was about this wide, and at the top it was painted white, the walls, but there was red. And I said, Doug, why is all that red on the plasterboard or whatever? Oh, that's where I murdered my first wife. And I says, really? Well, that was just not true. But anyway, we turned, though there were 2 little rooms.
Oh, so small.
They were darling. We fixed it up beautifully. And they had you had a double bed upstairs
Right.
there, and Doug had furniture for dresses.
Well, so back to George though. So we're living in this little house, and my mom was a worrier, and she'd call and says, is George looking for a job? Oh yes, he sure is. And he's sitting there in his pajamas. And, you know, Nancy was teaching him something about math, about mathematics, and he was going to interview in banks. Well, he went to different banks, and he went to Washington Mutual. Of course, Uncle Dietrich was there, and he was hired there. And he thought, you know, the man in charge of personnel, they called it then personnel, said, George, down here, you know, this is a savings bank. And what we like to have our future employees do is visit other banks to make really sure that they want to be here because we like longevity. And that is so important. And so he said, we'd like you to stop in at Washington Mutual, at Seattle First and People's Bank. And George said, well, actually, I had a job offered at Seattle First, but I delayed in answering, and they gave it away. So I learned a lesson. He said, but I will go up and see who you would like me to see at People's Bank. So George went up to see this gentleman, Mr. McLaughlin, I think his name was, and had a visit with him. And the gentleman said, well, George, would you go upstairs and fill out papers? And George said, well, I don't know that I should be filling out papers. I have another job, and I'm just here for this visit. And he said, well, then what if I offer you $100 more a month? And George says, well, you've got me. I'm here. I'll go fix those papers right now. So he came home, he says, I'm working for People's Bank. It was just like that. So, I mean, Washington Mutual, Uncle Dietrich, you lost him. So that's how that one went down. And so he never quit serving the church because St. Thomas, Father Val Spinoza was retiring and he needed help. And George was down there for him. And then John Houston was left holding the whole bag. George was down there for him, running the Sunday school, doing services, doing the Friday morning service. And then it got to be that he was considered what was called non-stipendiary. And he traveled miles, even taking Greyhound buses to go to little churches in faraway places to help these young clergy have a day off, you know, to get a full weekend. Because back to our weekends, it ended up I went to see Father Christie at Trinity Church, at Epiphany Church. And I said, Father Christie, I should never come here and complain to you. He said, Patsy, didn't your father tell you what I told him? And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, we were at Rotary sitting next to each other when I saw your engagement picture the day before in the paper, which I have right here, I think, or I guess, no, it's my wedding. He said, I said, Ferdy, I'm so pleased your daughter is going to be marrying one of us that wear our collar backwards. But he said, she's going up to be with the Holy Terror. Oh, I shouldn't be saying this. But anyway, that's how it was. And he was a very difficult clergyman. He'd had a heart attack. And George did everything in the world. And he started, they had tried to get underway under another clergyman, a little mission up in Monroe, and it didn't work out. So George found another place and got that place. It was packed every Sunday. So he was at St. John's and he was at Our Savior's in Monroe. And really dedicated, and went to the prison on Wednesdays.
We had the dinner party here for non-stipendiary.
Yeah, then that was after, he had retired
there were
from
about
full
12
ministry.
men, the lawyers and Harry Wappler, the weatherman on TV.
Yeah, he was Episcopal priest. And
yeah.
so he maintained until, and we've been real churchgoers until recent years. And even that environment has changed to the point that spiritually we find peace in other places, and it's just the way we are thinking right now. I mean, for instance, at St. Thomas, Nancy and I gave over the front door of the church, hung three beautiful flags, and one was the state flag, the county flag, or the city, let's see, one was the state flag, the King County flag, and
United States.
the American flag. I wanted those in memory of Hank Schmitz, who died in the war, and of my uncles and my dad when he died. And Father Bruick said, I'll be sure that his name is added to the memorial book. And because my dad was at this point the only living one when I did this, and Nancy was with me. Well, you know, things changed. They redid the church. They took down the flags. Nobody cares about the flags. They don't matter anymore. So when I was told the flags were no longer there, I spoke to somebody and they pursued it. And then I heard back, well, yes, they found the church flag, and they thought, well, they could stick that in the parish hall. And I said, well, what about that American flag? Well, they don't know anything about it, and they're really not too interested in pursuing it any further. So, you know, on that note, that sends me a real message. And I give to the church, because, you know, I support that church, but I mean, George served there for so many years, and without pay, and it was our parish. It's where our daughter had her adoption blessing. She was baptized by the bishop at Diocesan House, and that's how it all went down as far as the church.
I don't really have any other questions at this point. I think that's pretty good. Any other questions you ladies want to ask?
Well, I could tell you kind of a